Hey everyone, Laszlo Montgomery here. Welcome back to the China History Podcast. Last time we convened, we were in the Northern Song Dynasty, looking at the five founders of Neo Confucianism. So far, we're 3/5 of the way there. Last time we looked at Zhu Xi, Shaoyong, Zhang Zai, and right now we're going to finish off the Cinco Fundadores by looking at a couple of brothers. Cheng Hao, who lived 1032 to 1085, and his younger brother by 1 year, Cheng Yi, 1033 to 1107.
I think I mentioned this. All these five philosophers who were so instrumental in the growth of Neo-Confucianism, they all lived at the same time and knew each other. In fact, the Cheng Brothers' father used to have philosophical debates with Zhu Xi, Shaoyong, and Zhang Zai back in the day. Cheng Hao and Cheng Yi both studied under Zhu Xi. These Northern Song philosophers, they lived during the best of times, the reigns of Emperor Renzong, Yingzong, and Shenzong. These were the glory days of Su Shi, or Su Dongpo. He too was a contemporary of the Cheng Brothers. If you were someone who was part of the educated elites of Northern Song society, this period of these five philosophers, 11th century Kaifeng must have been the scene of some of the best repartee the tea houses of China had seen since who knows when. When you talk about the two Chengs, we think of Li. Li is one of those Chinese characters with a lot of meanings, more than 15 of them. But the one definition of Li that we are most concerned with is inner essence, or principle. Cheng Hao and Cheng Yi didn't create the idea of Li. It originally came from Buddhism. But they took it and turned it into one of the key points of Neo-Confucianism. And for this reason, these two brothers, more than the three philosophers mentioned in the last lecture, can be regarded as the true founders of Neo-Confucianism. This whole idea of Li was paramount to Neo-Confucianism. The Chengs were the first to call Li the ultimate reality of the universe and made it central to their philosophical system. Li was the essential ingredient that separated Song Confucianism from the long-standing traditional Confucianism going back to the Han. Cheng Yi's concept of Li focused on the difference between form and matter. Those of you who studied Aristotle know he too wrote about what was matter and what was form. Cheng Yi postulated that all things in the world must be the embodiments of some principle, some Li, inside of some material. If a certain thing exists, it must contain a certain Li, an inner essence or principle. We'll get to the material part in a second. The great inspiration for developing this idea for Li came from the moral lessons studied in the 10 wings of the I Ching. These were the Shi Yi. If you recall the 10 wings, the 10 commentaries written by Confucius mention the idea of the Tao. This Confucianist Tao, however, isn't the same Tao as discussed in Taoism. This Tao, or way, that is discussed by the Neo-Confucianists is the way that controls each separate category of things in the universe. Cheng Yi studied the 10 wings, or the appendices, they were also called, in order to understand the Tao, and from the Tao he derived his idea of Li. The Cheng brothers had one disagreement that in their lifetime never got reconciled and ended up causing two schools of Neo-Confucianism to emerge. With respect to the all-important concept of Li, principle, inner essence, these two brothers parted ways. The one thing both agreed on was that Li and human nature are the same. But as far as the mind goes, and the Chinese called the mind Xin, which usually means heart, but Xin was the term used in Chinese and a lot of other cultures too to symbolize the mind. Cheng Yi said, yes, Li is human nature, but the mind part, the Xin part, that is not Li, that is Qi. The mind belongs to the world of substance and matter. Cheng Hao said, the mind and Li all in one. That's where they parted ways with respect to the underlying concept of Li. Cheng Yi said, this Xin, the mind, this part is separate from the Li, and is in fact Qi. Now to most people that all seems so trivial and not worth losing sleep over. But in the bubble of Chinese Confucianism in the 11th and 12th centuries, it was the biggest thing going on. And each view had its followers and detractors. And from these two slightly different ways of looking at the same overall philosophy, there developed the two schools of Neo Confucianism. From Cheng Yi's idea that human nature and the mind are not joined together, evolved Li Xue, the school of principle. And for Cheng Hao, his followers called his thought Xin Xue, the school of the mind. It said the mind and human nature were all one and contained the same Li. Han Yu established the idea of the Dao Tong, the passing of the Dao of Confucian tradition from Yao, Shun, Yu, Kings Wen and Wu, the Duke of Zhou, and then to Mengzi. And after Mengzi, there was a long interruption that carried into Han Yu's day, almost 1,000 years later, Tang Dynasty days. But Cheng Yi proclaimed that this Dao Tong was now carried forward from Mengzi, after so many centuries, all the way up to these northern Song days, and that his brother, Cheng Hao, now carried this Dao Tong mantle. The champion of the Xin Xue school, the school of the mind, Cheng Hao's idea that mind and human nature are one, was Lu Jiuyuan, 1139 to 1193. He's probably better known as Lu Xiangshan, the master of Xiangshan. They didn't carve this on his tomb, but he was also well known as Zhu Xi's main rival. And when the two of them would hold public debates, that drew crowds in its day. Zhu Xi's coming up in a bit. Lu Xiangshan became the greatest spokesman for this Xin Xue school of the mind version of this Song Xue, which is the general term for what people in my zip code call Neo Confucianism. So Song Xue, Song studies, comprised all this new, high-octane Neo Confucianism thought that all came about during the 11th and 12th centuries. The Xin Xue school of the mind denied the existence of any truths other than what one gained through their own awareness. According to the school of the mind, you became your own authority on what is right or wrong, true or false. Lu Xiangshan famously summed it up this way, quote, "The universe is in my mind, and my mind is in the universe." End quote. They accept Li as the explanation of all phenomena. The school of the mind, they were in lockstep with Mengzi. Humans were born innately good, and they came into this world already containing all the moral values and virtues that Confucianism taught. Well, we talked about them enough. Let's bring them in finally and see what was so great about Zhu Xi, or Zhu Zi, Master Zhu. Next to Confucius, in the world of Confucianism, that is, he's arguably ranked as second most important. He was born in Fujian in October of 1130. The northern Song got its lights punched out in 1127, and now the Zhao family, who was the royal family of the Song, was keeping the dynasty alive in the south, reorganized around Hangzhou rather than the previous capital, Kaifeng, which had been overrun and captured by the Jurchens. So now we're in the southern Song, and Zhu Xi was a product of this southern Song era. When Zhu Xi was born, Cheng Yi had already been gone 22 years. The teachings of these 5 northern Song philosophers had had enough time to get sussed out and to mature a while. Where to take it from there to a higher state of perfection was left to Zhu Xi. Zhu Zi came from a poor scholarly tradition that went back 5 generations. His father died in a political struggle, and like Mengzi's saintly mother, Zhu Zi's mom raised him and was equally lionized as a model for a mother's dedication to raising her son under unenviable circumstances. And I'll have you know, with respect to Confucian propriety, the record stated, Zhu Xi's mother knew how to act. His father had arranged for several old friends to educate Zhu Xi after his passing. So Zhu Xi received a very diverse education from teachers of Taoism, Buddhism, as well as Confucianism. He mastered all this thought. By age 18, Zhu Xi had passed the Jinshi degree and was posted to his home province of Fujian. As brilliant as he may have been, Zhu Xi's political career didn't see him rise terribly far up the Southern Song cursus honorum. It was written that Zhu Xi had a reputation for falling into the category of officials who did not seek to enrich themselves from their public services. These were foul political times, and Zhu Xi wound up on the wrong side of the emperor on something and had to pay a political price for that. He was one heck of a prolific writer. His work, The Recorded Sayings, was 140 scrolls long. He left behind for posterity 300 chapters of writings containing almost 1,000 poems, official documents like memorials and petitions, and letters covering every subject that was on anyone's mind back in the 12th century. Zhu Xi's time was contemporary to that of the Second and Third Crusades. Saladin, Henry II in England, Maimonides, Angkor Wat in Cambodia just had its grand opening. Very exciting times in the world. He also wrote this handy little guidebook that no one was ever without. It was called the Jia Li, the Book of Family Rituals. This slim volume set everyone straight on the rituals, ceremonies, and anything that an elite family of the day might require for weddings, funerals, every occasion you could imagine. Zhu Xi wrote the definitive book, and if you followed it, you'd know how to do everything in a way Confucius would have approved. His Jin Se Lu, or Reflections on Things at Hand, contained the entire history of the development of the Neo Confucianist movement, beginning with these 5 Northern Song masters. Zhu Xi's commentary on the work of all 5 is considered the definitive insight into their work. When the history books mention that Zhu Xi synthesized the thought of these 5 Northern Song thinkers, it was this work, the Jin Se Lu, where he did it. Like his predecessors, Zhu Xi had a deep concern about the way people in his day practiced their Confucian beliefs. He saw that rituals and ceremonies seemed to be only done just for the sake of doing them. There was no feeling, no oneness with the performance of the rituals. It was as if tradition dictated it, but people practiced it like getting out of bed in the morning and going to work. And for this reason, Zhu Xi believed if people's grasp of Confucian thought was so superficial and done without a conscious thought, then they were just missing Master Kong's whole point. Zhu Xi taught to read less and to just take the time to focus and concentrate on the core ethical teachings. That's why it was Zhu Xi who said, the 5 classics were great and all, but as far as Zhu Xi saw it, all you really needed to keep close at hand were the 4 books, the Si Shu. Nothing crystallized the pure essence of Confucianism like those 4 books, the Lun Yu, Mengzi, Zhongyong, and the Da Xue. So Zhu Xi took Han Yu's original idea that grouped these 4 books together as a new Confucian canon. And pretty much after this point, they are officially known as the Si Shu, the 4 books. At first, the Confucian canon of sacred texts had begun with the Liu Jing, the 6 classics, which became the 5 classics after the Yue Jing, the classic of music, was dropped from the list. And you can get the entirety of Zhu Xi's Li Xue philosophy from reading all his exhaustive and easy-to-understand commentaries on these 4 books. Though he wrote commentaries of other classics, it was these commentaries on the Si Shu that are considered by many to be Zhu Xi's masterwork. By 1313, the 4 books will become the standard textbooks for Confucian education, and Zhu Xi's commentaries will serve as the cliff notes. And mind you, not everyone agreed with these viewpoints of Zhu Xi that were adopted by the state as the official national version of Confucianism. When Zhu stepped into the shoes of the ancients, he took a few liberties with what he said they would have said. Philosophers throughout the ages did this. They did it with Confucianism in the Han, the Tang, Song, and again in the Ming. Hey baby, you gotta freshen it up from time to time or else it becomes irrelevant. The problem was that who was to say what the Zhou-era sages would have agreed to or not? So you had all these great ideas that were popular, some sponsored by the state, but not everyone was in agreement with everyone. It was with respect to Li that Zhu Xi particularly looked at things from a different angle. Zhu Xi said, quote, In the universe, there is Li and there is Qi. Li is the Dao that pertains to what is above shapes and the source from which all things are produced. The Qi is the material that pertains to what is within shapes and is the means whereby things are produced. Hence, men or things, at the moment of their production, must receive this Li in order that they may have a nature of their own. They must receive this Qi in order that they may have their bodily form. End quote. Zhu Xi basically says, when an individual thing comes into existence, a certain Li is inherent in it, which makes it what it is and constitutes its nature. Human nature is nothing more than the Li of humanity that is inherent in the individual. This Li makes that thing, whether it's us or something else, what it ought to be. Zhu Xi said Li and Qi go hand in hand. Quote, the Li constitutes only a pure, empty, and vast world, without shapes or traces, and so incapable of producing anything. But the Qi has the capacity to undergo fermentation and condensation, and thus brings things into existence. And yet whenever the Qi exists, Li is present. The Supreme Ultimate, or Taiji, that we mentioned when discussing Zhou Dun Yi, it embraces all the Li for all things. And everything has Li, so this Taiji, this Supreme Ultimate, ontologically speaking, is the ultimate, uniting all the Li of heaven, earth, and humans, Tian, Di, Ren, and beyond this Supreme Ultimate, there can be nothing else. And it was Zhu Xi who likened this Taiji, or Supreme Ultimate, to the godhead of other religions known in China at the time. Zhu Xi's renown and achievements lie in rounding out and finishing up all the new ideas that had coalesced around these 5 Northern Song philosophers, Zhou Dun Yi, Shaoyong, Zhang Zai, and the 2 Chengs, Hao and Yi. One other thing Zhu Xi placed great emphasis on was the act of learning. He called learning the principal goal of humankind, and he was against this idea of learning for the sake of advancing one's career. He insisted that learning was solely for one's personal growth and self-cultivation. The last years of Zhu Xi's life, he was a victim of political backbiting and intellectual intrigue. His teachings even came under attack in 1196, 4 years before his death. He was posthumously rehabilitated, though, in 1202. Zhu Xi worked all the way up until his dying days. It's said that when he passed, he was still working with his students on some passages from the Great Learning, the Da Xue, one of the 4 books. What's Zhu Xi's legacy? Like Mengzi and unlike Xunzi, he believed the universe was good and that man's nature is to be and do good. He was passionate about Confucianism and worked hard, successfully too, I might add, to reestablish the relevance of Confucianism in China as far as the nation's cultural and political integrity went. And like these other Neo-Confucians, he saw how people were turning their eyes away from the teachings of Kongzi and gobbling up Taoism and Buddhism instead to satisfy their desire for spiritual guidance and solace. His teachings allowed Confucianism to remain in that race. Zhu Xi knew his idea about Li and Qi was the answer to the question of how to explain the relationship of the human mind-heart, the Xin, human natural tendencies, and the emotions. And thanks to Zhang Zai, Zhu Xi was able to see that the Xin, the mind-heart, is the unifier of human tendencies and human emotions. And what Zhu Xi is credited with is, of course, building on the ideas that came before him. He's credited with creating this Dao Xue, this brand of Confucianism that stayed true to the great sage, but also was able to synthesize aspects of popular Taoist and Buddhist beliefs. And in so doing, in giving the public what they wanted, so to speak, Zhu Xi added about another 800 more years to Confucius's sell-by date in China. From Buddhism, he took the concept of Li, and from Taoism came Qi.
And that's as far as I'm going to take things for now. I thank you all for taking this episode in. More Zhu Xi next time, I assure you. And we'll also get started with the final philosopher we'll be looking at, Wang Yangming. You won't want to miss that. I sure wouldn't. Until that time, this is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from Los Angeles, California, wishing you all my very best and thanking you for listening and inviting you to return back next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.